and spent an amazing 4 years of my life in Lawrence, Kansas, back and forth to Kansas City, where I had a job. So I just love this. I will, Lucy, I'm going to share my screen if that's okay with you. And let's make sure, here we go. Let's do this. Slideshow, play from the start. I have to switch my displays. There you go. Is everybody seeing it okay? Awesome. So I think what's really important, first of all, is for you guys kind of to know the perspective that we come from here at the CSE Institute at Villanova Law. So our role is to educate and provide technical assistance to those who respond to commercial sexual exploitation in Pennsylvania, obviously, which is where we're located, the US and beyond, promoting victim-centered, trauma-informed, multidisciplinary collaboration. We equip policymakers in the broader community with the skills and knowledge needed to improve the legal system's response to CSE in order to support survivors and obviously hold perpetrators accountable. We center the experiences of survivors to inform the development of policies and best practices to combat CSE, and are committed to engaging the survivor community and shaping our positions. And I really think that this is the most critical piece of our mission, because, you know, I'm a lawyer, I can practice law, I can advise, I can write laws, I can advocate in the legislature, but unless, you know, we take the time to sit down and say to survivors who've lived through this and had that lived experience, you know, what did you need? What do you wish you would have had when you were, you know, being victimized? And in the life, I think that's irresponsible of us to write laws and change policies unless we have the people whose lives it would most impact sitting at the table. And then finally, we aim to create a community in which every human being is treated with dignity, compassion, and respect. And that's inspired by Villanova University's Catholic and Augustinian mission, because we are a Catholic school here. So I just want you guys to understand that here in the US, we hear so often conversations about prostitution policy, and they don't take all 4 policies into account. So we have the status quo, we have legalization, full decriminalization, and the equality model. And I hope that, you know, after these couple of minutes of my talking very quickly, that you'll have at least a rudimentary understanding of the differences among those 4. Understand how each policy option would address issues in the commercial sex trade, and review research on how maintaining the status quo. Now, I'm not going to get to all of that, you guys, but I am in education, and I firmly believe that the more knowledge all of you have, the better we will all be. And so I fully intend to share my slideshow with you guys. And as I go through it, before I share you, I'm not going to get into the substance of the slides at the end. I'll just tell you what's on them so that you know what the resource is available to you. So let's talk about prostitution policy and choice versus culpability, selling sex, which is prostitution, obviously, and buying sex, which is what we believe fuels the market for sex traffickers to be in the business that they're in. So just very quickly to contextualize all of this, and I want to say right up front, not all prostitution is sex trafficking. Again, not all prostitution is sex trafficking. I don't want you all to walk away thinking, I think everyone in prostitution is being trafficked. That's not true. But when you see the law of trafficking, and I've put up, you know, sort of the acts by the means of the purpose, this is the federal law. The purpose of sex trafficking is for a commercial sex act. That is what, by law in all 50 states, including Kansas and Missouri, prostitution is. So all sex trafficking involves prostitution, which means we cannot divorce the conversation of prostitution away from sex trafficking. They go hand in hand. And Peter and Ben, if you disagree with me on any of this stuff, please chime in and correct me. So we believe that the perpetrators of human trafficking are the ones that we need to focus on from a criminal perspective. We cannot police and prosecute our way out of this problem of the commercial sex trade. But when criminal justice does get involved, the law, the federal law, and the majority of state laws really do criminalize a broad spectrum of conduct. So we need to focus criminal culpability on traffickers, right? Pimp control prostitution, those running brothels, those running escort services by force, fraud, and coercion. We need to focus criminal culpability again on the buyers, which is why we're here today, and third-party facilitators who are making money helping out traffickers do what they do. So this is sort of why we have come to the conclusion the equality model is the best policy on prostitution and the commercial sex trade, because we know that for most, prostitution is a means of survival. We know that sex buyers are the ones choosing to buy sex as a means to pleasure, comfort, drugs, etc. We know that the leading causes of death for women in the commercial sex trade, specifically prostitution, are homicide and drug overdose. We know those with power and privilege are buying the bodies of those with far less power. And we believe that the choice and culpability, if we're looking at those in prostitution and those buying sex, clearly lies with those who are buying sex. We also know, and Peter's going to talk about this much more eloquently than I ever could, that gender bias and toxic masculinity are what are permitting men to evade criminalization. Those tropes, boys will be boys, it's the world's oldest profession, it's a victimless crime. So again, you guys, these are the 4 policy options: status quo, legalization, full decrim, and the equality model. What is the status quo? Prostitution's a crime. Sex buying is a crime. And that is true in every single jurisdiction in the United States, with the exception of 10 counties in the state of Nevada, where it is legal. I'm just going to pretend like those 10 counties don't exist for this conversation. The federal government cannot decriminalize prostitution. It is a state crime. There's no law that Congress can pass that could be repealed or passed to decriminalize the sex trade. This is a state crime. Every state has a crime of prostitution. Every state has the crime of buying sex, including those counties in Nevada, aside from those 10, right? So again, the federal government has jurisdiction over trafficking cases, because that's a crime, but not the crime of prostitution. So why do we want to decriminalize a person in prostitution? And the status quo is just leaving the laws the way they are, right? Prostitution is going to remain a crime. Buying sex will remain a crime. Obviously, trafficking will remain a crime. The question is how it is policed and prosecuted, how the criminal justice system looks at this, primarily nationally, with few exceptions. Those in prostitution are the ones targeted for arrest and prosecution. It's the status quo. Just leave things the way they are on the books. So why do we think that the people in prostitution should be decriminalized? We believe that they're a victim of a crime, not a perpetrator. And even if they don't have a trafficker, they are being bought for sex by someone who isn't necessarily Richard Gere and Pretty Woman. And yes, I am dating myself. We know that criminalization of people in prostitution, all people actually, is traumatizing and stigmatizing. We need to improve relationships between victims and law enforcement. We know that traffickers are deliberately targeting incarcerated individuals for prostitution recruitment. I can tell you that 2 weeks ago, we saw in the media, and I was speaking with our secretary of our Department of Corrections here in Pennsylvania. A woman was let out of prison, state prison. I don't even know the crime she was incarcerated for. And within a week had been arrested for prostitution. And according to the police reports in the media, it's because she couldn't make ends meet. She also had some really suspicious looking tattoos on her, which lead me to believe that there may be more than just prostitution going on. But if you guys are really interested in why this happens and how it happens, I highly recommend The Guardian's The Trap. Just Google The Guardian, The Trap, and it's on YouTube. It's a like a short little docuseries. It's not even a series, documentary. It's 32 minutes long. Peter and Ben and I know at least 2 of the survivors in it, and Peter works with Nikki Bell on a pretty much daily basis out of Massachusetts. So I really recommend The Guardian's The Trap. We need to diminish the permanent and temporary collateral consequences of persons in prostitution being criminalized. I do have lawyers who work for me, and they spend their full-time job trying to vacate the convictions of sex trafficking survivors, specifically convictions for prostitution and related offenses. We need to eliminate new opportunities for debt bondage. We know that our clients oftentimes have their traffickers pay their bail, which is cash bail. They have them hire lawyers, and they add that to debt bondage. And we need to avoid confirming negative messages that are propagated by traffickers. What is legalization? Legalization is what those 10 counties in Nevada have done. Also Germany, the Netherlands, and Amsterdam, New Zealand, some places in Australia, but the entire industry is regulated, meaning the government has gotten involved and regulated it, subjected to all applicable labor laws. And, I can get into the harms of legalization, but that means you can own a brothel, you can make money owning a brothel, you can sell sex, you can buy sex. So it's quite troublesome. And I have some scholarship out of New Zealand specifically that talks about, the toxic masculinity on the review boards. Decriminalization, which is this one really a huge conversation that's happening on the policy spectrum here in the US. That means decriminalizing consensual sex work, the buying and selling of sex. Don't expand, regulations to cover the industry. There's this belief that sex work is an exercise of personal autonomy where freely consenting adults exchange sex for money. And it really does fail to recognize the inherently exploitive nature of the sex trade. We're dealing with a lot of jurisdictions who've decided to decriminalize so-called consensual sex work, including the jurisdiction that I live in, Philadelphia, where I was the prosecutor for 10 years. And my question to those prosecutors always is like, well, how do you determine what consent is? Can consent be purchased? There's a power imbalance there. Also in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where this is going on, which is, a college town, I'm very concerned that they're decriminalizing consensual sex work. Does that mean that sex buyers are going to swoop in the form of sugar daddies and, prey on young college kids who think that, it's just easy peasy and you're going to get your credit card bills paid? There's all kinds of conversations that I think are erroneous, that don't look at the power imbalance, that solely look at this sort of on a transaction by transaction basis and don't realize the psychological and physical harms that are being caused, which brings us to the equality model and why we think this is the best one. So what does the equality model tenets do? There are 4 of them. Law enforcement and prosecutors make a concerted effort to exercise their discretion to not arrest and prosecute persons in prostitution for the crime of prostitution. Instead, they make a concerted choice to use their discretion to criminalize sex buyers and make a commitment to treating buying sex as a serious crime rooted in gender-based violence. Third, this has to happen. There must be a public awareness campaign that discusses and teaches everyone and educates them about the inherent harms of prostitution. There must be funded, robust, holistic exit services for people who want to exit the sex trade to do so. There's also a whole bunch of misinformation about how, internationally, the movement right now is for decriminalization and that's what countries are doing. That is unequivocally not true. Absolutely not true. The policy and laws in states, state parties abroad, meaning in Europe and other places, is this equality model. We know that it's been enacted in 10 countries to date, and there are 3 of them that have partial elements. So this is the part that I'm not going to get to because I want you guys to hear from Peter and Ben, but I want you guys to know that I've got a ton of resources here and data on where it's legal, on how decriminalization policy is happening in other jurisdictions, good stuff on where the equality model is in countries like, France and Norway and Sweden. I talk about seen and unseen, and I can give you guys this. It was a survey put together by the Topos Foundation on what is seen in prostitution and what is unseen, and the comparison by just average people in the US. And then we talk about what is each policy and practice, and we tee up here a little bit of a scenario. And then what would happen if the status quo were in place, what legalization or full decrim were in place, and what the equality model were in place. So we've done 3 little scenarios at the end, and I'm happy to share these and do a one-on-one with you, whatever you need, and answer questions with my slides. So that is me, Lucy. I'm done. I hope I was fast enough. Ben, you're next, right? I need to take it over to you. Ben, I want to hear from you.
Yes, Ben is next.
Thanks, Shea. Can folks hear me now? Thank you so much. You think that I would figure this out, but I got a new computer and all the tech settings have been redone. So thank you so much. I'm Ben Gauen. I'm a senior deputy prosecuting attorney out in King County, Washington. I'm based in my office right now in Seattle. Thank you for being here. You know, I think around, almost a decade ago, my office met with folks like Peter and a lot of the local survivors here and survivors of prostitution here. And we had some serious conversations about what our policy was doing to the community. And I think what we determined was that the then status quo policy of arresting and criminalizing people in prostitution and not really focusing on the demand or the traffickers was really doing nothing to move the needle. It was actually probably causing more harm to people in prostitution in the community. So we engaged in a concerted, intentional effort to really change our policy. And it closely aligns with the Nordic model or the equality model that Shea was just talking about. We do not have the equality model implemented on the statutory level, right? It is still illegal to commit the crime of prostitution. What we've done, though, however, is focus our policy in a different way in terms of how we approach this issue. There's going to be a slide that I'll have Lucy send out to you later on that shows in 2013, the first year we really implemented this, there was a complete inverse in the amount of prostitution versus patronizing arrests. Patronizing arrests are that of buying sex. That's what we call it in Seattle. And so the focus was not on arresting or prosecuting people in prostitution, but instead focusing on the buyers. And the focus on the buyers was a strategic decision based on data and studies showing that it is the demand for commercial sex that causes trafficking. And this makes sense, right? When we think about kind of a larger context, there are not enough people out there in the world who want to voluntarily, consensually engage in commercial sex, sell their bodies. So we just know that there's a limited supply, right? That freely want to do that. You've probably heard the phrase like, you know, no child wants to grow up to be a prostitute. And I think that's absolutely accurate. The demand for sex, though, is so incredibly high, both locally and nationally and internationally, that in order to meet that demand, traffickers have to find that supply because the profit margins are so incredibly high. You can sell a body over and over again. It's different than the drug trade. So in order to meet that supply, you have forced fraud and coercion or vulnerable populations being targeted, including minors, right? That's how you meet the supply, is that you start trafficking people. And Shea is absolutely right. There's such a symbiotic relationship between prostitution and trafficking. You really can't separate the two. So our policy with prostitution is a policy in regards to anti-trafficking work. What we've decided to do is turn really all of our attention to going after traffickers and buyers. We have a twofold goal with every kind of case we do, whether it's working with police to engage in an investigation or on the prosecution side. And that is, how do we reduce demand? And then how do we get people out of prostitution who indeed want to get out? How do we provide viable exit services to folks? Our local police departments have completely bought in on this and they understand it. And I think to the law enforcement detectives here, it on some level, it seems intuitive, right? When you're out there on the streets and you're dealing with people in prostitution, you don't really look at them as criminals. Oftentimes they're so incredibly broken. They have mental health issues, there's drug addiction, they come from abusive backgrounds, they're runaways, they're in foster care, they're domestic violence victims, and the list goes on. And you know that, you see it, it's part of your investigations. And it probably never feels that good to slap handcuffs on these people and cart them off to jail, knowing they're just going to be released the next day and they're going to have to go back to their trafficker, knowing that they didn't make money that night and then they're going to get beat up and the cycle continues. When we do our anti-demand work, our focus is on how we can reduce demand on a very kind of macro level and a micro level. And when I mean macro level, I'm talking about how do we engage community to really focus on intervention, upstream intervention work. On a micro level, it's who are we going to arrest and how are we going to change that person's behavior? How are we going to change that man's behavior so that he knows in the future that this is not an acceptable thing to do. It's actually, it's not a victimless crime. It's quite harmful. Our law enforcement operations primarily target buyers online, and then we're still doing some street side operations as well. We will have at any given time a number of police departments in the area conducting undercover operations on well-known prostitution websites, and you folks will have them in your community. Since Backpage was shut down, there have been dozens of other websites that try to capture that market share. If you are, if you don't know what those websites are, just literally Google it. Buying sex in Kansas City, escort service Kansas City, and you'll find websites. If you're still at a loss, then come talk to us. Come talk to Shea, and we will find those websites for you, because we know they exist in your community. We know minors are on those websites, right? NCMEC, we'll get NCMEC hits. We'll have parents or guardians or our child protective services let us know that minors are on there. We will then put detectives on there who have a fictitious persona of a minor. Now, usually when you post on those websites, you have to initially say that you're 18 or older, right? Because the website may take your post down, or somebody may complain about you. That's okay, because based on your training experience, you know that the kids that are on those websites, either they're lying about their ages or their traffickers are lying about their ages. So that's how you explain that to a jury or a judge later on. You engage in the conversation back and forth with the buyer. If you post an ad saying you're new to town, you're young, you post young pictures, which can be stock photos, or you can literally hire 18-year-old models who want to engage in anti-trafficking work. We're not talking about nude photos, of course. We're just talking about regular photos that can be posted on these websites. You will get dozens and dozens of email responses, text message responses, literally in the day or sometimes within the hour of the post. There's a conversation that goes back and forth. At some point early on in the conversation, the detectives say, hey, I just want to let you know I'm 15 years old. Are you okay with that? They'll provide the quote unquote menu. They'll get an offer and acceptance for a sex act. And, thankfully 9 out of 10 dudes are not going to respond after the age drops. But enough do respond where you can have anywhere from 10 to 30 arrests in one night, where they keep engaging in the conversation. They know it's about sex. There's usually some sort of anecdote that we throw in there for evidentiary purposes, like, make sure you use a condom, please bring a condom. Clearly this is a sex act we're talking about and not something innocuous. In Washington, because it's a fictitious victim, we have to charge this crime as an attempt. And to prove attempt, there needs to be a substantial step that shows the person's intent. So we will not arrest a person just by merely engaging in that conversation back and forth electronically, and perhaps after they've agreed to an offer and acceptance, knowing that the person there, or believing that the person they're talking to is a minor. We want them to show up someplace. So it's a meeting spot. It's a hotel. It's a car date. It's meeting at the mall where they're going to drive off to do the sex act. And as soon as that person arrives at the hotel, then they're arrested. We usually call the cell phone that they've been communicating with. It rings. There's a search incident to arrest that will produce the condom, the cell phone, the money. It's I would say in at least 75% of the cases, you'll have the exact dollar amount that was agreed upon. I'm going to pay you $200 for the sex act. We'll find the $200. We'll find the condom. We'll find the phone that was being used. The detectives are pretty creative. I'm not 18, so please bring a vape pen. Bring alcohol, bring wine coolers, and they'll bring that kind of stuff as well. Again, showing intent and showing that they knew, of course, the knowledge component that this person was underage. After a person is arrested, we will charge them right away. And our focus, it certainly is on accountability, is on deterrence, is on rehabilitation. And so we have sort of devised a scheme for that includes a program that Peter's going to talk to you about called Stopping Sexual Exploitation. I think there's a common myth out there that people who are going to show up to buy sex from a minor are pedophiles, right? There's obviously some sort of underlying deviancy, or they would never do that. I think that's a reasonable hunch to have at first. However, our data shows otherwise. These guys are not pedophiles by and large. They don't have underlying sexual deviancy issues. What they are is opportunists, and they don't care that the person is 15. They wouldn't care if the person is 20 or 25. They want young. They don't want somebody who's in their 60s who's involved in prostitution for 30 years. But they're not necessarily targeting children. They just don't care. And we know that that's a recipe for disaster, because there's a number of kids in our community who are on the streets or online, and therefore they're being commercially sexually abused. To that end, we make these guys go through an evaluation process. In Washington State, it's called a psychosexual deviancy evaluation. These are performed by licensed sex offender treatment providers. I know you probably have those in your community. And it's a pretty intensive evaluation process that contains a polygraph, a sexual history evaluation, a number of psychological battery tests, and so forth. And that's how we typically find out that these guys are not pedophiles. They don't have, they're not psychopaths or, with crazy personality disorders. Oftentimes, they are broken individuals suffering from mental health issues, sometimes childhood trauma. Other times, they're just way in over their heads in toxic masculinity, and they've had underlying issues that never really have been addressed. And that's where Peter's program comes in. So at the time of sentencing, we have this program that's really been, it's been embedded in our system for so long. The judges know about it. The defense attorneys know about it. Our Department of Corrections, community custody officers know about it. Probation officers and other municipal jurisdictions know about it. And it's this 10-week program that really gets at the root causes of why men engage in this very harmful behavior. We make them go through the course. We don't make them go through it successfully, meaning they can just sit there with their arms folded the whole time, never participate, and literally flick me off or the program facilitator off on the way out the door. They just have to go through the program and show up. But what we found is the program is incredibly effective at changing behavior. And we have, I think Peter is going to talk about the data momentarily, but we have a number of exit interview data that shows that 93% of these guys have decided that they will never buy sex again after they go through this program. And I think one of the other really critical things to look at is their continued involvement in a men's accountability group. Over half of these guys want to continue to be involved in this community. There's absolutely no incentive in terms of the court process for them to continue to be involved in it. They don't get there's not a better deal for them. They don't get a reduced fee or fine. They don't avoid prison or jail by going continue to be involved in the program. They literally just have found a place, a space to share in men's accountability work with other folks, other men in that cohort. And I think that is incredibly powerful and is testament to this program. I can tell you that, one of the best parts of my job is when these guys show up at their sentencing hearing and they've maybe already started the program or finished it. And instead of, blaming the police or talking about maybe that they felt the whole thing was unfair and some other indignant response to why they're in court, they literally talk about victims of sex trafficking and people in prostitution and how they realized that their behaviors is attributed to this awful scourge in our community. And that is incredibly powerful for me to hear, and it just is testament to why we continue to facilitate men's entry into this program. And that's just part of the accountability. These guys oftentimes will spend some time in jail. We don't send them off to prison unless there's a long criminal history that includes, traditionally other violent crimes or sex history. We also make them pay a fee, and this is part of our statutory scheme that I can talk about later on if folks are interested. But we mandate the legislators here in Washington mandated a fee for sex buyers to pay, and half of that money goes back to direct survivor services, again, to get people out of prostitution. There's inadequate funding for that measure. And the other half goes directly back to the pockets of law enforcement to conduct these very resource intensive investigations, because oftentimes they do involve a lot of person power and full day operations that take a lot of people and bandwidth. So this is one way to ensure that the operations can continue, right, in earnest, is for the buyers to fund those operations. Oftentimes they're not paying restitution, so this is really a way to, a way of restorative justice so that they can pay for the harm that they've caused and stop future harm. I am more than happy to meet with law enforcement folks or prosecutors on this call to really get in the weeds about these investigations, how we conduct them, the successes, the things to look out for. I think we really wanted this discussion this morning to be kind of a summary of what we're doing, and hopefully to pique some interest, and we can follow up in the future. And I will also be sending out, like Shea has, a little bit of a PowerPoint that shows some of these data points in graph form and really what our policy looks like. I've had the pleasure of working with Peter Qualliotine for a few years now, and when Peter left Seattle, fortunately, the SSE program, the Stopping Sexual Exploitation Program, did not leave with him. He's watering those seeds all around the U.S. now, including in your jurisdiction. But we've continued to ramp up the Stopping Sexual Exploitation Program, not only in King County, but all across the state of Washington at this point, which is very cool and exciting. And I'm hopeful that after this presentation, folks in this call who are decision makers will really consider implementing this program, because I can tell you, bar none, there is no other program available for buyers that is going to change the hearts and minds of these men to this degree, and actually going to prevent harm in the future. Peter, pleasure of introducing you.
Okay, well, thanks, Ben. And it's really an honor to be here with Lucy, to follow Lucy and Shea and Ben. They're all real role models for me. So I am Peter Qualliotine. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I've been working on the issue of commercial sexual exploitation for about 30 years. And this really is a culmination of all that work. And so I'm thrilled to be here today. I started out working on this issue not knowing it was what I was going to be doing. I was primarily interested in stopping domestic violence. And I was interested in stopping domestic violence because I grew up in a domestic violence household, and because I recognized that really early on that although my father's violence became a problem for my mom and my siblings and myself, that it was really his problem, his inability to deal with frustration, anxiety, disappointment, criticism, and his feelings of entitlement to take it out sideways on the people around him, on the people who had less power than him, on the people who he loved and who loved him. And so as I got older, I saw it wasn't just my household, but it was in lots of households. And when it was happening, that it was primarily men's violence. You know, most men don't do these types of things, but when these types of things are done, they're done by men. I got older and saw that sexual assault was connected to this as well. When some female and male friends of mine started talking to me about the abuse they experienced as kids, I connected the dots there as well. And so back in the 1980s, I got very interested in what men could do to engage men and boys to stop these forms of gender-based violence. And so I started working with, in Portland, Oregon, with the Portland Women's Crisis Line to develop curriculum for high schools and middle schools to prevent gender-based violence. And we included, sexual harassment, dating and domestic violence, and sexual assaults. And if I could travel back in time and talk to my younger self and say, well, what about prostitution? I would look at myself from the future and say, what are you talking about? What does that have to do with anything? That's a victimless crime. It's something people freely choose to do. And so I'm going to focus over here on these issues. What happened, though, was through my work on domestic violence, I came across this unique organization in Portland at the time called Council for Prostitution Alternatives. And like Veronica's Voice, they were founded by survivors as a way for others to get out of the life. And like you all know, when I met them and heard their stories and heard of the abuse they experienced as kids, the neglect they experienced as kids, the homelessness, the use of drugs and alcohol to cope with trauma, and the resultant issues of chemical dependency that came from there, the traffickers, the violence that they experienced in their life at the hands of their buyers as well as the hands of their pimps. And I started to look at this and say, hey, this isn't really different than a lot of other forms of gender-based violence. And in fact, it's rooted in the inequality, in gender inequality. And so back in the mid-1990s, I started the first sex buyers program in the country in Portland, Oregon. It was called SEEP, the Sexual Exploitation Education Project, possibly the worst acronym for a group ever. So we did much better, down the road many years later when we started talking about SSE, which is Stopping Sexual Exploitation, and that's the program that I'm here to talk to you about today. Presently, I'm 2 years into at least 3-year project, hopefully beyond that, called Modeling Equality Ending Commercial Sexual Exploitation. And this is a project where I'm trying to take the lessons that we learned in King County about the way that we operationalize the equality model. Like Ben said, we do not have the equality model in legislation, but what we had was a community who was coordinated and shared an analysis of this issue that was rooted in the same values that Shea spoke about earlier. Right? We really saw prostitution as a practice of gender subordination. Right? And so I think that what we looked at was, okay, so if we don't have this legislatively, how can we do this through policies and practices in partnership that are accountable to the most vulnerable and marginalized members of our community? And so this was a pretty unique approach. I mean, as Shea said, it's about a dozen countries worldwide that have adopted this legislatively. But we were really, really pioneers in King County about how do we do this on the ground? How do we operationalize the equality model? Hopefully cement it into legislation later on. But how do we do this? And one way that we did it was through the creation and implementation of SSE, which is Stopping Sexual Exploitation, a program for men. And I'm going to intersperse a few quotes with sex buyers that came through the class as I go through this presentation today. And here's one to start things off. A guy said, it's simple really, if you're paying someone, that can't really be a free choice. They don't really want to be with a bunch of dumpy middle-aged guys like us. It's exploitation, pure and simple. I didn't want to see that before. I think that what's surprising to people when they hear about the work I do and others are doing with sex buyers is that they think that somehow the buyers don't know that this is an abuse of power, and that they don't know somehow that the person doesn't want to be with them. Like Ben said earlier, they just don't care. They in fact do know. And when confronted with it and forced to kind of think about it and forced to step into a fuller sense of who they are, to regard the humanity of the person and people who have been exploited, they really are pretty quick to come around to that position. The other thing that I do with the buyers the first time I get with them to have an individual meeting is to talk with them about the definition of sexual health. The World Health Organization says sexual health is a state of physical, mental, and social well-being and relating to sexuality. It requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. And I always ask the participants, is this what sex buying was for you? And almost unequivocally, every now and then there's somebody who disagrees, but almost universally, they say, this is not about sexual health. This is about exploitation and an abuse of power. Maybe not in those terms, but hopefully by the end of the class, they come around there. But at the beginning of the class, it's more couched in terms of their shame and their lack of understanding about their real motivations to participate in this. And so sex buying is problematic, and it's problematic both because of the harm that's caused to people who are exploited, prostituted, and trafficked, but there's also a connection between sexual aggression and prostitution against people who are not in prostitution. Buying sex has been associated with perpetration of physical and sexual violence against intimate partners, perpetration of rape against both partners and non-partners. College-age men who use women in prostitution have committed more sexually coercive behaviors than men who had not. And this is international. Internationally, men who had ever bought sex are more likely to perpetrate rape. And so I think this flies in the face of the common misconception that's out there that thinks somehow, if you don't have prostitution, this legitimate target group over here, that these men are just going to go rape other people in their lives, or that they're going to target other people in the world. What we know is that if somebody is in the headspace where they're able to dehumanize, objectify, and target somebody in prostitution, they don't suddenly treat the other people in the world and in their lives, especially women, with a lot of respect and with mutuality, right? The same sort of power over dynamics that are at play with those people in prostitution will leach over into their intimate partner relationships as well. And I can tell you, I've spoken with countless men about kind of the role that their sex buying played in their intimate partnerships. Because contrary to a lot of people's belief, most men that buy sex do have a steady, intimate sex partner. So I'm going to dial back the clock a little bit and start talking to you about how we started to think about SSE, or how I did. After I founded that first class in Portland in the 90s, I taught a lot of different types of sex buyers education program. And back in 2011, I was working in Seattle, and I was doing a one-day model of sex class, because that's what the municipality of Seattle was promoting at that time. And I was just so sure it wasn't working. It just was such a disappointment. The model I had done in Portland had been a 3-day model, and that still was not enough time to kind of get through to these participants. And so I was fortunate enough to be invited by a friend and colleague for decades by the name of Melissa Farley to help her do a research project in Boston that looked at men who bought sex and compared them to men who didn't buy sex. And through the process of doing that research and looking at it and writing about it, I really started to come to terms with the fact that over the ensuing decades since I had created that original sex buyers class, that we had a lot more insight into sex buyers and their behavior, and that we could create a much better model of program. And anybody who wants to contact me more specifically about this report, it's available online, but I'm happy to talk with you at length or do another presentation specifically on the data that came out of that and how that informed ultimately the curriculum of SSE. But it was through the course of that I really got a fire lit under me about wanting to create a more robust model of sex buyers intervention that was based on the best data that we had available, and created the most promising practice in terms of sex buyers intervention work. And so, as things often happen in serendipitous types of ways, it wasn't too long before I had connected with Ben's office. After that, I had gone on from a group in town called Youth Care, working with commercially sexually exploited youth, to co-found a group called Organization for Prostitution Survivors, or OPS. And when I founded OPS and created the men's accountability programming, it became a priority of mine. We also did exit services for adults that were directed by Noel Gomez, who was my co-founder. But it was a priority for me to address the issue of demand. And one of the things I thought that might be good was a new model of sex buyers intervention program. And why did we need a new program? Again, I'm happy to talk at length about why the old programs don't work. But in short, they're one-day classes, if that. And Chicago has a 15-minute video that they show. And if you can swipe your card and pay the fine, you're free to go. They're held in large groups. It's a lecture format. That's really a shotgun approach, right? It just, a lot of information gets spewed out there. Well, it's not like these guys don't know the information. And that's one of the things that we learned through the research. The guys are aware that people in prostitution are harmed and that they can be arrested and that there are health impacts. And every kind of bucket that most John schools cover, they're well aware of all that information. And so we need to dig deeper than that. And in order to do that, we need multiple sessions over a longer period of time. We need to connect with them individually and in smaller group sizes, where we're heavy on the interaction with one another. As it's a court-mandated program in part, it's important to acknowledge the limitations that a program like this has. Like other forms of gender-based violence, when you have court-ordered group programming, it's not like it's going to be 100% effective, certainly. But we also needed to operate from a clear shared understanding. And pedagogical goals about what the problem was and what we were trying to address. And because of the limitations that I just addressed in the former bullet, it needed to be process-based. We could control what was going to happen in the class itself. We didn't have a lot of control over what would happen when they got out of the class, but we needed to set the stage in the class itself for an understanding of where this behavior comes from, what it's about, and how and why it's in their best interest to change it. In terms of the implementation of the program itself in King County, we were lucky enough to be a pilot city that was, or jurisdiction, or location that was chosen by a group called Demand Abolition back in 2014. And part of the grant funding that OPS received was in part to create and implement this new model of sex buyers intervention. And so in partnership with the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office and a lot of other great partners, 1 year later in January of 15, we launched the first cohort of the new Sex Buyers Intervention Program, Stopping Sexual Exploitation. And I think that just to dig in a little bit to what happens in Stopping Sexual Exploitation, or SSE, what we know is that this is something that men have a lot of ambivalence about, right? Men who buy sex generally want to stop buying sex. And this has been proven in research for the past couple of decades. That's surprising to most people because they think that men buy sex because it's somehow meeting this physical need that men have, and that it's just something that men do. And it follows all of those cultural tropes that Shea was taking apart so expertly early on. But from the men themselves, here's why they buy sex. I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women. Right? This is what a sex buyer himself said. When I asked him further about what this meant to him, he said, well, I hate women because I was married to one of them 15 years and she left me and took half of everything I have. And so I'm never going to trust another one of them again. And so I'm just going to go ahead and buy sex, right? And so for me, this was informative because it really tied up with this next reason that we see about why these men say they buy sex. This guy says I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection, right? I'm afraid to be in an equal mutual relationship with another person that I treat as a human being. And so I'm going to go ahead and buy sex and get past that risk of being rejected or my fear of intimacy, right? It's really rooted in this kind of inability to truly connect with another person in an intimate and meaningful way, and a need rather to control the other person and take away their choices and their options. This is why it's connected to domestic violence and sexual assault and sexual harassment, right? If we've learned anything from quid pro quo sexual harassment from the Me Too movement over the past few years, it's that sexual activity should not be a condition of employment because it's about inequality, right? If it shouldn't be a condition of employment because it creates inequality in the workplace, then it creates inequality in the world, right? And it's simply not okay. And the thing that gets me both infuriated and hopeful about this issue is that while we know the bulk of people in prostitution want to get out, the bulk of the buyers also want to stop this behavior. And when given kind of the path through, the hope is that they can find it and keep on it. Yeah, and here's just another guy, really clearly, I bought sex because I didn't have to care about the other person. I didn't have to treat them as a person. They're a commodity, they're something I can buy. And this fits in with what Ben was saying, right? That it wasn't so much they were targeting minors, they were targeting prostitutes, and they didn't think of their identity as a person beyond that of the bucket of prostitute, right? And that bucket, it means consensual in the mind of a buyer. So they're not thinking about them like somebody on their daughter's soccer team. They're thinking about them as somebody who's a teen prostitute. Okay, so the program serves, in addition to sex buyers that have been referred by the criminal justice system through Ben's office and other avenues, probation and other courts. In addition to them, we have sex buyers who choose to attend the program voluntarily. And we're continually trying to engage men to get to come to the class before they're arrested. And we also have men in the class who don't maybe buy sex, but want to learn more about how to reduce sexual exploitation and promote women's equality, right? So this is the accountability piece. getting other men from the community to kind of come in and have these conversations about what we can do to end gender-based violence and inequality. And what we asked of our partners in King County was that we would get each participating law enforcement agency to do, based on their resources and size, to do one online reverse sting every month or two. And if you have a bunch of participating or localities, then you can pretty quickly, that adds up to being able to be a pretty healthy class size. From the prosecutors in King County, we recommended SSE as a condition of sentence. It's not going to happen that way everywhere, and some it's going to be more of a diversion or deferred sentence or some other options. And from the judges, we asked the same. So that's pretty much how we asked things to go in King County. Another SSE participant was reinforcing this fact that the arrests are important. To be honest, I don't think that anything else would have stopped me. I needed the arrests to stop, to make me and take a long look at myself and what I was doing. At the same time, the program is necessary. Here's a participant, the arrest stopped me. I would have never bought sex again, but the program taught me why I should never buy sex again. And this is what the buyer's gonna need 6 months or a year down the road, when the memory has grown dim over that arrest, and that he needs to have it reinforced about why this is not consistent with the values he has as a human being. And what we try to do in the class itself is to get them to reframe the way that they understand prostitution away from a victimless crime and towards a system of gender-based violence. We help them take apart the way they learn about sex and sexuality, the role sex has played in the lives of themselves as individuals and within their all-male peer group. And then we help them transition from those unhealthy modes of masculinity that have to do with control of other people and explore consensual, healthy modes of masculinity that are equal and mutual and consensual. Of course, this is a process, again, it doesn't happen in an overnight. So what happens, the journey through SSE is that the men apply. We do an individual session with them over the telephone where we engage them in motivational interviewing. And then a one-on-one individual session, and then a multi-week course following that. Excuse me. The topics that we deal with are socialization of gender, different forms of gender-based violence, issues of oppression, vulnerability, mutuality, and consent, and the will to change. And again, I'm happy to talk more about this with y'all. In terms of the success of the program, we've been through 5 years plus now of the class. 97% now is the current number. Men say they will not buy sex again. If we look at what they thought before and after the class, we see that many agree with the statements, prostitution, people in prostitution like what they're doing. If I give her money, she should do whatever I want. Women are not harmed by prostitution, men have a right to buy sex, and women cannot be raped. Women in prostitution cannot be raped. And then after, you see the significant shift in their attitudes about these particular issues. But I always like to point out that at the end of the class, after they've been through the class, that there's still 7 men who participated in this class who say a woman in prostitution cannot be raped. Right, and so that's where I like to say we need to be realistic. When I talk about it, it helps probably 90% of the people that come through. I believe that that's true. Not that none of them will ever buy sex again, but I think that there's a subgroup of people that come through this class who it's not going to be useful for. But by and large, it's not the bulk of them. Certainly, the bulk of them are changed significantly. And when they're asked afterwards additional questions about the sex buy, most say that they're going to talk to other men about the negative impacts of buying sex. They're going to talk about the negative impact on their lives, right? Which I think is very significant, that they recognize that this wasn't a behavior that was working for them, and they changed their own selfish self-interest, because these are folks with narcissism and with a small n as a big part of their identities in the world, right? And so, yes, it's in their best interest as well. They also agreed that it had a negative impact on people in prostitution, right? So what this suggests is that those process-based goals that I outlined to you earlier about reframing prostitution, changing beliefs and attitudes about masculinity, and encouraging healthy modes of masculinity were met through the class itself, that it is successful in doing that. And we don't need to just look at the data. We can take a listen to the men that come through. And what they say is things like, this class helped me to take a long, hard look at myself and my relationships. I want to use this to make my relationship with my wife a mutual one rather than a controlling one where I'm trying to control her. We've had several men that have been through the class in Seattle that have self-referred to domestic violence programs because of their participation in the class. And this was a great one. Here's a participant who came through and said, when we asked him, how are you going to live your life differently after having been in the class? He said, I'm going to raise my son differently because I don't want him to be angry and depressed all the time like me. Right? And to me, that just spoke volumes about not just stopping this behavior in the individual, right? But stopping it in the circles around him through kind of the whole landscape of social ecology, because this man is going to go back into the community, talk to other men, be a better partner, talk to his children, and especially his sons differently. Right? And so that is my piece of the puzzle today. There's my email address, and each and every one of you, please feel free to reach out with any questions or anything that you have for me. And at this point, having used too much of my time, which is not uncommon for me, I would like to pass it over to Vince to talk a little bit about how this has been playing out and how we've been developing the program in Kansas City. So take it away, Vince.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And I will try to be brief so we have time for some questions if we need them. Yeah, so in February, Peter completed the training of 3 of us to facilitate the SSE class. And this Saturday, I will complete our first class. So again, I'm Vince Tucker. I'm Director of Men's Education for Veronica's Voice. So I've been with Veronica's Voice for about 9 years. I'm on the Empowerment Board, serving in communications and grant writing, in lead a redemptive community at Lakeland Community Church, serving as a liaison between Lakeland and Veronica's Voice. So I've been passionate about leading efforts to engagement to change the culture that propagates systemic violence and oppression against women. So when we discovered Peter's modeling and equality program and SSE, like we knew we had the support we needed. He spoke our language when it came to the subject of men's accountability. 3 things that we need to keep in mind on this subject, and Peter's program does this. And this is really aligns with what we believe at Veronica's Voice, is to hold men accountable without judgment, which is a fine line to walk. Use our leverage as men to influence other men without taking credit from and taking control over the women who have survived prostitution and are leading the movement to facilitate change. In other words, guys, so we can use our masculine influence with the way we relate to other men on this subject, but let's at the same time don't re-exploit and step over the women who are truly the true leaders of this movement, the women who have survived prostitution and who are educating us about the realities of this system of oppression. And then third thing, and Ben talked about this a little bit, creating a true restorative justice model. As a condition of sentencing, these men will pay a fee for the class, which almost entirely goes to the services for women in our Magdalene KC residential program, which is a 2-year program set up to help these women heal and then teach them how to thrive back into the community, living in a way that's safe and free from harm for them. And so these guys are financially supporting the population that they have exploited or are seeking to exploit. So what does all this have to do with you all here in the meeting with us today? Well, we all have the same goals for a fair and just society. But for all of you, law enforcement, the judiciary, prosecutors, and so on, you can only enforce the laws, right? It's been, again, kind of got into this a little bit. You see the underlying issues, but you don't have the money or the human resources to take care of all of that. You have a job to do. we here at Veronica's Voice, we have the knowledge and the experience and the resources to support the women trapped in the life of prostitution, to address the root cause, which is the men who buy. But we need support from community leaders in position of influence, which is all of you. So we need each other. It's very logical for us to come together as a community and see what we can do to support one another in our common goal, at least the way that we intersect regarding lawlessness and prostitution, both buying and selling. So we provide a meaningful alternative for the women who sell, and we provide education and diversion for the men who buy. So what we need from all of you, and I think you saw that on one of Peter's slides, this is huge for us to have that trifecta of the law enforcement and the judiciary and the prosecutors in a particular municipality or county to work together with us and get us on the same page. So we need to know what will be required for arrest and conviction and sentencing so that we can reach our common goal that we all have of having law-abiding, just communities, not just following the law on the books, but a true justice and equality, a true equity, not just the literal manifestation of the legislation on the books, right? So as men and women of the law, you have a job to do. And sometimes, and Ben spoke to this so eloquently, you have a really strict and rigid job that may require you to detach from your human conscience to maintain order in the community. So like you see the brokenness and you see the underlying issues, but you're often powerless to do anything about it. But as men and women of consciousness here at Veronica's Voice, we see the brokenness too. We see the underlying issues and we jump right into that. But we also recognize that there does need to be law and order and enforcement of that law and order. There needs to be structure. And we recognize the tough work that you all do and the challenges you face and the limited resources and the heartaches that you see and the tough decisions you have to make. And we also see the criticism that you receive serving the community in a way that is often thankless, especially those of you who are on the streets. It seems like you're in a no-win situation. So how do we come together? I would say there's no singular answer. Peter has shared with you a tremendous amount of success of modeling quality and SSE in King County. But what we are now trying to do is figure out how to best replicate that in other areas. So this doesn't mean that everything we do in the Kansas City area will be exactly as it's been done previously. But here we have Peter's wisdom, we have Ben's experience in implementing some of this, we have Shea's perspectives, and then we have the local heartbeat of Veronica's Voice, led by women who have lived a life of prostitution and can tell you all about it from an inside perspective. And make no mistake, these women are true warriors, survivors of things that most of us can only imagine. But when they managed to escape the life of prostitution, instead of just moving on, they ran back into the fire to help those still inside. And they began doing the difficult work also of educating the community about the realities of the lives of the most stigmatized human population on the planet. So we're completing our first class and we're real excited about it. Again, Peter kind of touched on this a little bit. It's basically a 10-week thing with 8 classes. He went over the subjects. And the first 2 meetings before the class actually starts are more assessment. We conduct a motivational interview with the participants to kind of gauge their interest and where they're at. And we find that they're more receptive to the class if we do an MI with them first. My personal background, my other passion has to do with analyzing our choices for food and how that affects personal health, the environment on the planet, animal welfare, food scarcity, all of the social constructs, spiritual constructs of that. I've gotten a lot of certifications and things related to that, including I just completed a class at the Mayo Clinic for health and wellness coaching, and I'm seeking coaching hours to get my certification. So we really dive into motivational interviewing a lot, and that class has taught me a lot as well. So I'm happy to bring that skill set to my role as a facilitator for these classes. So So here's the thing, this class has taught me a lot as well. So we are all, and I'm kind of speaking to the men right now, but women, I think you understand this too. Like we're all under the influence of societal's pressures to define us as men. And so a big part of that centers around our relationships with women, both in our intimate partner relationships and our friendships with coworkers and community advocates. So this is a powerful class on a subject that is typically a taboo subject, even with generally healthy men with high emotional IQ. I've learned a lot about this class personally as going through the training and as facilitating it. It always reminds me to check myself as well. And this class is so powerful for all of us, and especially for a population of men who we facilitate, who cannot seem to grasp the concept that there actually is something to filter and assess with themselves and to self-reflect.